We're all going to the World's Fair. We're all going to the World's Fair. We're all going to the World's Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well, and I am actually extremely excited to be talking about this movie because I am talking about a psychological horror low-budget indie film by Jane Schronenbaum, a non-binary director, titled We're All Going to the World's Fair. As should be kind of obvious, this movie fits in right in my particular niche. Again, indie horror, low budget, non-binary director, and it's a film that kind of is talking about identity and coming to terms with oneself through a horror lens. All very much like Jessie's circle of interest. The only thing that could have made it more interesting to me was if it somehow had Star Trek involved in some way. Other than that, though, this is perfectly square right in the middle of my niche, and I was so excited to be able to go and see this movie, and in a lot of ways it definitely lived up to my particular hype. But this is not going to be a horror movie for everyone. I'm just going to forewarn you right up front that this is not a horror movie for everyone. Basically, the story of this movie, and we'll talk a little bit more about how this movie tells that story in a moment, but the basic concept is that a young girl named Casey in high school basically starts to participate in a creepypasta role-playing horror online game called We're All Going to the World's Fair, where she performs sort of a ritual in the sense that she puts her blood on the screen and she sort of says we're all going to the World's Fair into the computer in a sort of similar ritual to what a lot of us would do as a kids of my generation when we said Bloody Mary in the mirror back in our bathroom, sort of calling forth this horror. And the idea is that you would slowly change over time due to having performed this ritual, and it's different for every single person. And you get the sense that Casey is taking part in this game because it allows her to feel a sense of connection with other people who are doing it as well. A lot of this movie, at least in the beginning, showcases Casey watching other people who have posted videos online, very creepy and very strange videos of how they feel they have changed by participating in this game. Whether it be someone who said oh, I feel like I'm playing Tetris on the inside, or a girl says she's turning into plastic. And you get the sense that she feels a sense of connection to these people because she's playing this role-playing game with them. And yet there's this sense of isolation that permeates this entire film. To roll back a little bit, as I sort of hinted at, this movie is not told in a very traditional way. It is, again, very low budget, and a lot of this movie takes place either on or watching computer screens. It's not in the sense of something like John Cho's Searching or the Unfriended horror movies where everything takes place on a computer screen, but a lot of it is very much delved into the world of existing on a computer. And a lot of the footage is filmed from a webcam or watching Casey look at her computer. And because of that, while Casey is watching these videos and finding this creepy community online of creepypasta stuff and posts and things like that, she is very much isolated. Every shot of Casey is her alone in the darkness. We get the sense that she has a parental figure nearby, her father, who yells at her a lot, doesn't really treat her well. Never get really a sense of abuse, but she feels very cold and isolated and alone in her entire life. And I think the kind of weird connection that I could make to another movie that this film has the sort of same vibe of in a very, very strange way is 8th Grade. If any of you have seen 8th Grade, well, that was a much more coming of age, fun, comedy drama movie about a young girl sort of finding her identity through YouTube videos and finding others. This has that same feel with a young girl sort of making internet videos in order to try and find herself and her connection to somebody. But this obviously has a much more horrific, isolating feel because of the psychological horror feel of it. But unlike 8th Grade, which tells a fairly traditional, straightforward, Hollywood-style narrative with its own little twist and indie, feel to it, this film is very much more of a mood and tone piece. Don't go into this movie expecting a straightforward narrative necessarily. It's more you get to sit in the vibe of it all, and it's an exploration of a feeling and a concept of how the internet gives us a sense of community and isolation, and how we perform our identities to try to live up to what we think is expected of us because we're constantly being watched by a community that we don't even really have a connection and understanding to, and yet also trying to find that connection as well, try and find something real within our performative nature. It's such an interesting discussion about our current online lives that we have today and how we are always performing for people but yet are yearning for that connection, and how that affects kids of Casey's age in high school in a lot of psychologically damaging ways or dark ways. I don't necessarily want to say this is like she's some sort of psychologically traumatized child, because I don't think that's the thing that the movie's getting at, but it does talk about how it does sort of warp our brains a little bit and how we sort of constantly have to think about this presentational aspects of ourselves and this performative aspects of ourselves while also being isolated and yearning for connection. And the ideas of isolation are deeply explored throughout the entire film. For example, Casey never appears on screen with another person throughout the entire film. She is always isolated in her room, despite always looking for that sense of community that she finds through following the Creepypasta game. But the isolation is also explored in many other ways too, about how she yearns to find some form of connection with something outside of herself. For example, in one of the film's earliest scenes, in order to try to go to sleep, Casey watches an ASMR video that she herself recorded, in which she talks to herself to try to calm herself down. And it sort of seems to be the only way that she is able to relax and able to sleep is by having something externalized, but that she made herself. And so this whole idea of just yearning for that connection through this digital age of being able to create artifacts that we send to each other and other people find, even if it's just these small groups of people, is very much the idea that this film is trying to explore. And I don't want to get too spoilery within this. There's not a ton to spoil, but there is a moment in the film, or a few moments in the film, where the story sort of jumps to a different perspective. And it has this sense of like dread on top of it because of what you would expect this sort of other perspective to have when we know that it's a young girl that this person is watching. Again, I'm probably giving a little bit too much away there, but you'll sort of get the feeling when you get into it. It's not too much of a spoiler. But the way the movie sort of has empathy for these characters and explores these characters is intriguing, because it ultimately doesn't go the way you'd expect, and it does ultimately go back to that idea of how isolated we all feel. And there's this permeating sense of hope and sadness that goes throughout the film. Again, it's much more of a mood and vibe piece. But ultimately, I think what this does, too, is ultimately explore the idea of the creepypasta, strange, isolating world that you can find in the dark recesses of the internet late at night, when you're sort of sitting alone on your phone or on your computer, just trying to find something scary but meaningful, and the things that we sort of build up around that in these small communities, not necessarily the large, big communities of thousands of people, but like the videos that are made of 20 or 30 views, which only a small community of people, very close-knit group of people start to watch and get involved and sort of see a moment into somebody's mind that is strange and weird, but ultimately true. And I thought that it was a really good exploration of that, and a very strong and very confident first outing for this director. This was their feature film debut, and I thought this was just a really evocative tone piece to explore a lot of these concepts with. The film is ultimately not providing any answers. And again, this is not going to be a movie for everyone, so be aware of that going in. But it was within that very confident and very strong, and had me like interested in every single moment of it, despite it being a very kind of slow moving, very more atmospheric film than anything else. So that's my thoughts for We're All Going to the World's Fair, a very disturbing and unsettling horror film that, again, won't be for everybody, but it certainly was for me in a very surprising and strange way. So I'd highly recommend it to all of you looking for kind of whatever weird vibe that this movie has, but don't go expecting something traditional, because it is most certainly not that. But very excited to see more of what this director is going to do, because apparently they have been signed to do a film with A24 next. So we'll definitely see more of them in the future, which I'm very excited about. So that's my thoughts. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below on this film if you have seen it. But other than that, thank you so much, my friends, for watching. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.